Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to discuss how United States participation in World War I helped to transform the United States both domestically and in the eyes of the world. So we're going to look at the Great War and how it affected the American home front, and then we'll eventually talk about, the brief participation of American soldiers in the war and how the war came to a close. So here are your basic objectives for today, and let's dive in. Obviously, World War I is a massive industrial war on a scope that we've never really seen before. And so the United States has mobilized for war in the past. The Civil War would be the largest example of American mobilization up to this point. As you hopefully remember, the Spanish American War was kind of a hot mess as far as organization goes. And so this mobilization campaign is going to be much larger, much more sophisticated, and because we've now entered the progressive era, is going to involve much more of the federal government. For example, we're going to institute another draft, which is something we haven't done since the Civil War. So the draft is going to be an important component of this. We're going to significantly increase tax rates in order to pay for the war. So fortunately, we have now this income tax that we're able to do. We're going to switch our production from consumer products to wartime materials. And we're again going to have women flow into factories in large numbers to replace the men who are being drafted and sent overseas. In order to help organize this effort, we're going to create this thing called the Council of National Defense, and this is going to be the federal government's attempt to standardize all of this stuff. And so, for example, the War Industries Board is going to coordinate our industrial efforts to try to push our production and move from making, consumer products into shells and bullets. The Food Administration by Herbert Hoover is going to coordinate our agricultural response to the war. The Railroad Administration is going to is going to organize railroads and nationalize our rail system temporarily. And the National War Labor Board is going to make sure that we don't have strikes, labor stoppages, things like that, which would really cut down on our ability to fight the war. And so the national government is going to be intimately involved in all these places. You'll notice former President Taft is here. Future President Herbert Hoover is heading the Food Administration. And so this is really, we're bringing in the federal government in a way that we've never really seen before. The Food Administration was incredibly important because, of course, in order to fight this massive industrial war and mobilize millions of troops to go fight overseas, we need to make sure we can feed and provide for those troops. And so we're going to encourage people to change their eating habits. We're going to push growing victory gardens. We're going to encourage people to use their food more responsibly and waste less of it. We're not going to get into the type of rationing and ration cards that we're really going to see in the Second World War, but there's really this patriotic duty for Americans to change their diet in order to make sure that our soldiers have the food to fight abroad. And Herbert Hoover is going to do a fantastic job both setting up the U.S. Food Administration during the war and then also providing relief for struggling countries after the war. We're also going to see women taking on larger farm roles, as obviously many of the men are going off to fight. And so we're going to see World War I, much like many of these other conflicts, changing gender roles and allowing people who were previously marginalized to step into larger positions in society, which is going to kick off demands for more rights after the war. We get the first creation of national propaganda in the United States. We, of course, have had political cartoons and political propaganda going all the way back to the Founding Fathers, but this is the first time that we're going to create a federal government organization whose goal it is to create propaganda to push support for the war. The Creel Commission, or the Committee on Public Information, is going to create propaganda to sell war bonds to finance the war and to try to shape American opinions to get us to willing to make the sacrifices necessary to fight the war. We see some demonization of enemies, specifically Germans, showing them as militaristic brutes or evil Huns. And the goal, of course, is to build popular support and to demonize our enemies. This is going to become an important part of our war efforts going forward, and this is going to become part of the Second World War fight as well. So here's some information about the Creel Commission and and the effect of the creation of this propaganda. So pause, read, and let's move forward. Obviously, the effect of this is going to be to create anti-German sentiment and push back against Germans. We get this sort of anti-German hysteria during World War One, where we're going to rename sauerkraut Liberty cabbage, rename hamburgers Liberty sandwiches. Theodore Roosevelt is going to demand that there's no such thing as a German American. You're an American American, or you're a foreigner and a traitor. And the federal government is going to pass laws like the Espionage Act, which makes it illegal for people to, undermine our war effort and pass messages to pass information to the Germans, stuff like that. Here's Woodrow Wilson justifying these additional measures. So take a minute, pause, and read. And we'll move forward. As part of this, we also pass a new Sedition Act, which makes it illegal to criticize the government and push back against any of these things. We haven't talked yet about the Federal Bureau of Investigations, but it was created during the Progressive era, and it's our domestic spy organization, and it's going to significantly step up its activities during the war to make sure that no one is trying to undermine the U.S. war effort and betray us to our enemies. This, of course, leads to a question about constitutional rights, as we see here. So take a moment, pause, read this. And we see people like Eugene Debs, who's the labor leader, who's going to try to convince people to avoid the draft, be thrown in jail. And of course, there's real questions about constitutional rights and free speech here. For example, Schenck versus United States involved a guy who was handing out pamphlets to convince people to avoid the draft. He was arrested. He tried to argue that his actions were free speech. And the end result of this, so here's Eugene Debs being arrested. So take a moment, read, and then we'll move on. In the end, what the Supreme Court ruled is that speech that presented a, quote, clear and present danger to society is not protected speech. The metaphor that the Supreme Court used is you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater, creating a panic which might hurt and injure people. And the same way you can't yell you should avoid the draft and not go fight in World War I, because that represents a clear and present danger to society. And so the Supreme Court starts to establish that not all categories of speech are protected, and you can be jailed for speech that is damaging to society. World War I also kicks up the Great Migration. We talked about this previously, that African Americans were leaving the Jim Crow South for jobs in the North / opportunities in the West. But World War I significantly accelerated this because there was massive demand for people in war industries in the North. And obviously those opportunities were not available to African Americans in the South. And so we got a flood of Black people up to northern cities. You could see a significant jump in the Black population of Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia, and many of these major cities from 1910 to 1920 as African Americans flooded north to take advantage of jobs in the war industries. This, of course, is going to lead to some conflict between African American leaders, with older leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois articulating things like the idea that Black people should, quote, first your country, then your rights, basically demonstrating that if Black people used this opportunity to show their loyalty to the nation, then they would be granted greater civil rights afterwards, and they'd be in a stronger position to argue, with younger civil rights activists like A. Philip Randolph arguing that no, the country needs to actually treat Black people better if they want them to show up in times of trouble. So you should take a moment and pause and read A. Philip Randolph statement against the war, which of course is going to lead to him getting arrested and charged under the Espionage Act. As far as actual fighting goes, we're going to raise this massive army called the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force. It's going to be under the command of General John Pershing here. He was the guy who led the expedition to try to capture Pancho Villa. And our goal is going to be to get into the war before the Russian troops totally leave, because just about this time, the Russian Revolution is happening. The Russian provisional government under Kerensky attempts to stay in the war, but Lenin and his Bolsheviks stage the October Revolution in 1917 and sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which gets the Soviet Union or Russia out of World War I. And so the Germans are launching a spectacular counterstroke, the whole Kaiser battle, the whole Kaiserschlacht plan. St. Michael's campaign is flooding into France. And so American troops are trying to shore up European defenses before the French and British are overwhelmed by this new German army that has just been freed up by the treaty with Russia. So we're going to flood Europe with troops, honestly, much quicker than most people anticipated. The United States is going to be able to effectively mobilize due to the organization of the progressive era and the activities of the federal government much quicker than we had in the Spanish American War, and with a lot less friction. And so hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of American troops are going to start flooding into the trenches of Europe. These American troops were often known as doughboys because they were so much larger and better fed than the European troops at the time. European troops, after years of fighting, the Europeans had lowered their standards as far as height and weight requirements for troops. And so, whereas the Europeans were really down to the dregs of their soldiers at this point, Americans coming in were large, well fed, and so, doughboys. We're going to learn very quickly that we don't know how to fight in World War I. There's a couple really embarrassing sort of incidents that really sap American morale early on. And the Germans are going to try to take advantage of racial strife in order to convince black people to not fight. So take a moment and pause and read this. The general African American response to these German messages were, yes, we understand that that's happening, but we're over here to fight for the Allies. We're not going to betray them and fight for the Germans. Eventually, Americans participate in the Second Battle of the Marne, which stops the German offensive, and then also participate in the 100 Days Offensive, or the Ardennes Offensive, pushing the Germans back until eventually, after the Second Battle of the Somme, the Germans surrender. World War I ends on November 11th, 1918, what is known as Armistice Day, and the German government is overthrown, and celebrations break out across the world. Obviously, this account of American participation in the war is naturally truncated. Obviously, there's a lot written about this. There's a lot of movies focused on this period in history. So if you're interested in going out and consuming that, there's lots of opportunities for you to do so. For our purposes, World War I was unpleasant. We fought only really in the last stages of it. And yes, Americans did suffer horribly. And we did play a huge role in the victory of the eventual Allied powers. But it was really only the end of the war that we were really involved in. Honestly, probably more influential was a massive global pandemic that kicked off near the end of the war. All this travel around the world led a mutated flu, which became known as the Spanish flu, to spread around the world. In order to try to stop the spread of this disease, we closed down schools, churches, public places, and yet the pandemic spread around the world, killing hundreds of millions of people and really shutting down American society, at least for a few years. Like most pandemics, it didn't die out all at once. There were occasional outbreaks again, and the death toll is probably much larger than was originally reported. But in the end, the Spanish flu did eventually die out, and life did somewhat return to normal. Here are our objectives for today. Hopefully you can answer them in some detail. For next time, we're going to look at the aftermath of this, how the United States dealt with the devastation in Europe, how they dealt with the crisis of demobilization, and how World War I forever changed America's place in the world and their domestic politics. So we'll pick up with there next time. For now, thank you for listening.